My name's Evan. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my life, my father has loved nothing more than to remind me how much of a disappointment I supposedly was. I grew up hearing phrases like useless dreamer and lazy boy tossed around the dinner table like they were my actual name. It didn't matter if I brought home straight A's, if I got into a good college, or even when I landed my first real job. He always found a way to downplay it. According to him, I was never enough. And as much as I hated to admit it, I carried that weight with me for years. It ate at me, made me doubt myself, and kept me in a constant state of trying to prove him wrong. You'd think by the time I became an adult and built a stable life of my own, he'd finally let it go. But if anything, it only got worse. He found new ways to humiliate me, usually in front of other family members. Whenever there was a gathering, he'd lean back in his chair, glass in hand, and laugh as he told the same tired story about how I once tried to start a business in high school by mowing lawns and somehow lost money. He'd embellish, of course, throwing in details about how I couldn't even fix the mower when it broke or how I charged less than the neighborhood kid down the street. The whole table would chuckle uncomfortably, and I'd sit there, cheeks burning, pretending it didn't sting. My mom always stayed quiet during these moments. She'd shoot me a quick sympathetic glance, then look away. My younger sister, Melanie, wasn't much better. If anything, she liked to pile on. She'd grin at Dad's stories, add her own little jabs, and remind me how I was the golden child in my own head, not in real life. By the time I was in my mid-20s, I realized I wasn't just dealing with a father who had no respect for me. I was dealing with a family who had decided their favorite pastime was undermining me. So I did what anyone in my shoes would. I distanced myself. I threw myself into my career, worked long hours, and stopped showing up to every family dinner I was invited to. I thought maybe if I created space, they'd lose interest in mocking me, or maybe, just maybe, they'd realize what they were losing. But my father wasn't the kind of man to just let go. He wanted control, and my absence only seemed to make him more determined to remind me that, in his mind, I was still the boy who couldn't even handle a lawnmower. The breaking point came a few months ago, though I didn't see it coming. My dad had gotten into a bitter legal dispute with my late uncle's family over property. Somehow, in that mess, he decided I should be dragged into it. I tried to avoid it. I wanted no part in their endless squabbles, but before I knew it, I was subpoenaed. I had to sit in that courtroom, forced to listen as my father spun his narrative about how I was too irresponsible to be trusted with anything, not even a share of family property. And then came the words that still ring in my ears. My son can't even pay his own bills. He's always been a useless dreamer. I felt the room tilt for a moment. It was like being 10 years old again, sitting at that dinner table, every insult heavy on my chest. But this time, something was different. I wasn't the kid who had to take it. I wasn't even the young man quietly grinding to prove himself. I was a grown adult, with years of hard work behind me and a life I had built without him. And then, the judge leaned forward. He actually paused, looked straight at my father, and in the kind of calm, deliberate tone that cuts sharper than shouting, said, "He's been a senior surgeon for almost a decade." The air in the courtroom shifted. My dad's face went pale, like the blood drained out of him all at once. For the first time in my life, he had nothing to say. The silence that followed wasn't just uncomfortable, it was suffocating. I sat there, stunned, my heart hammering in my chest. After years of being painted as a failure, the truth had been laid bare in front of everyone, and it didn't come from me. It came from an authority my father couldn't dismiss, couldn't talk over, couldn't mock. That moment was just the spark, though, because what happened after, that's where things really started to unravel. After that day in court, you'd think my dad might have backed off. Most people, when publicly embarrassed like that, would at least learn to keep quiet. But my father wasn't most people. He had too much pride, too much stubbornness baked into his bones to ever admit he was wrong. Instead of easing up, he doubled down. The next week, I got a phone call from Melanie. She started off with her usual sugar-coated tone. "Hey, Evan, I just wanted to check in on you after court. Dad's been really upset, you know?" That last part carried a subtle accusation, like I'd been the one to embarrass him, not his own reckless words. I stayed silent, letting her talk, because I could tell she had a script. She rambled about how Dad was just under stress and didn't mean what he said, then slipped in, almost casually, "Besides, you know how you come across sometimes. You don't really share your life with us, and it makes it look like you're hiding something. Maybe if you were more open, Dad wouldn't have felt like he needed to say those things. That was Melanie in a nutshell, always finding a way to twist the knife while pretending to soothe the wound. I told her I wasn't interested in debating my career choices or my father's inability to show basic respect. Her tone instantly shifted, sharp as glass. "You're always so defensive, Evan. It's no wonder Dad thinks you're ungrateful." Then she hung up. A few days later, Mom showed up at my apartment unannounced. She carried a container of food in her hands, but her eyes were heavy. "I just want peace in the family," she sighed as she sat down at my kitchen table. She explained that Dad felt humiliated and blamed me for letting the judge make him look stupid. I nearly laughed at the absurdity of it. The judge had spoken the truth, and somehow, I was the villain. Mom leaned in, lowering her voice like she was sharing a secret. "If you could just talk to him, maybe apologize, it would help calm things down." Apologize. That was her solution. Apologize for being publicly insulted, apologize for the career I'd built, apologize for finally having the truth spoken out loud. I told her I wouldn't be doing that, and her expression hardened. She left the food on the counter, stood up, and said, "I don't know what's happened to you. You used to be such a kind boy. Now it feels like you only care about yourself." She didn't even look back as she walked out. The whispers in the family started soon after. A cousin texted me saying he'd heard from my dad that I was arrogant now and thought I was better than everyone else because of my job. Another aunt cornered me at the grocery store and asked why I was turning against my own blood when my father had done so much for me growing up. It was like an entire narrative was being rewritten behind my back, and I was the villain in their version of events. Meanwhile, my dad played the victim. He told anyone who'd listened that I had embarrassed him in front of a judge, that I was disrespectful, that I had abandoned the family. He conveniently left out the part where he called me useless in open court. He told the story so many times that by the next family dinner, when I reluctantly showed up, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The room went quiet when I walked in, and all eyes darted between me and my father. He barely looked at me, but when he did, it was with that smug, tight-lipped smile that said I've already won them over. And the worst part? It worked. When the meal was over, Melanie announced that she and her husband needed help with a down payment for a new house. My dad, without missing a beat, said, "Evan can help with that, can't you? He's doing so well now, after all." The entire table turned to me, expectant. I felt like I'd been ambushed. I shook my head and said calmly, "I'm not giving anyone money." The silence that followed was deafening. My father scoffed loudly, then leaned back in his chair with that mocking laugh I'd grown up hearing. "See? All that education, all that money, and he can't even support his own family. Just proves what I've been saying all along. Selfish, useless dreamer." I clenched my jaw so hard I thought I might crack a tooth. The room buzzed with uneasy laughter, a few awkward coughs, and then Melanie burst out. "Wow, Evan, you really can't let go of the past, can you? We're family, we help each other." But that wasn't help. It was expectation, obligation, manipulation, and it was becoming clearer than ever that no matter what I did, no matter how much I achieved, they would always try to pull me down, to keep me in the role they had written for me since childhood. That dinner was the moment I realized something. This wasn't just about disrespect anymore. This was about control. And if I didn't put a stop to it, they would keep tightening their grip until I either broke or finally fought back. The weeks after that disastrous family dinner felt like a slow drip of poison. Every interaction, every phone call, carried some new demand or guilt trip. If I didn't answer, they accused me of ignoring the family. If I did pick up, it was always the same chorus. "Help your sister, support your dad. Why are you being so cold?" It didn't matter what I said. They had already decided I was the problem. Then came the betrayal, the kind that takes whatever fragile thread of trust you have left and severs it completely. It started with a letter in the mail. At first glance, I thought it was junk, but when I saw the sender's name, my bank, I felt a knot twist in my stomach. Inside was a notice. A loan application had been filed under my name, flagged for additional verification. I froze. I hadn't applied for any loan. When I called the bank, the representative hesitated, then explained that someone had attempted to co-sign using my information. The applicant? Melanie. I remember sitting at my desk, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles went white. She hadn't even asked me. She had taken my personal information, likely something she'd gotten years ago when we were filling out family paperwork, and tried to use it to secure a massive loan. The bank caught it because the signatures didn't match and because, thankfully, I'd set up alerts for anything tied to my credit. The rage I felt in that moment is hard to describe. It wasn't just anger at the act itself. It was the realization that my own sister, the person who grew up in the same house as me, who shared holidays and childhood memories with me, had looked at me not as a brother, but as a resource to exploit. And I knew, without even asking, that my father was behind it. It was too brazen, too reckless, too entitled to be just Melanie's idea. I called her immediately. She answered on the second ring, her voice dripping with fake cheer. "Evan, how are you? I didn't waste time. Why did you try to take out a loan in my name?" There was silence for a beat, then a sharp exhale. "Oh, that. Don't be so dramatic, Evan. Dad said it would be fine. We were just trying to speed things up with the house. You make plenty of money. You wouldn't even notice. You stole my identity." I cut in, my voice shaking. "Do you understand that? That's a crime." Her tone hardened instantly. "Don't talk to me like that. We're family. You're supposed to help. Dad said you'd react like this, all self-righteous. But it's not a big deal. If the bank hadn't made a fuss, it would have gone through, and we'd all be better off." I hung up before I said something I couldn't take back. My hands were trembling as I set the phone down, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to believe it was just her, but deep down, I knew exactly whose fingerprints were all over this. The confirmation came 2 days later, when Dad showed up at my apartment unannounced. He walked in without even waiting for me to invite him, sat down on my couch like he owned the place, and said, "You made a fool of yourself with that bank nonsense. Do you realize how childish you look, making a big deal over paperwork?" I stared at him, speechless. He leaned forward, his voice low and condescending. "That loan would have helped your sister start her life. You think you're better than us because of your title and your paycheck, but you're not. You owe this family, Evan. Without us, you wouldn't be here." I felt something break inside me then. It wasn't just the trust, it was the illusion that, deep down, they cared about me at all. They didn't. To them, I was nothing but a bank account in human form, a punching bag when they needed someone to blame, a scapegoat when their lives didn't measure up. I told him to leave. He laughed as he stood, shook his head, and muttered, "Ungrateful. Always have been." Then he walked out, slamming the door behind him. I sat there in the silence of my apartment, the weight of betrayal pressing down on me like a physical force. For years I tried to keep the peace, tried to shrug off the insults, tried to be the bigger person. But this wasn't just disrespect anymore. This was theft. This was manipulation on a level I couldn't excuse or ignore. And in that moment, I knew there would be no going back. The days after my father stormed out of my apartment felt like walking through fog. I went to work, I scrubbed into surgeries, I spoke to patients with the same calm professionalism I'd always carried. But inside, I felt hollow. Every time I pulled off my gloves and washed my hands, I'd catch my reflection in the mirror and barely recognize the man staring back. A senior surgeon, respected in the hospital, but somehow still reduced to a child in his father's eyes. Worse, reduced to a tool to be used and discarded. The betrayal with the loan left ripples I hadn't expected. My credit report flagged the attempted fraud, and I had to spend hours on the phone with banks, verifying my identity, putting freezes on accounts, and explaining to strangers that, yes, my own family had tried to forge my name. Each call chipped away at something inside me. It wasn't just paperwork, it was humiliation. I had to say it out loud, admit it, make it real. My sister tried to take out a loan in my name. The more I repeated it, the heavier it felt. Meanwhile, the calls from family didn't stop. They weren't apologetic, they were hostile. Melanie left a voicemail crying about how I had ruined her chance at a future. My mom texted me paragraphs about how family comes first and how I was letting resentment destroy everything. Even an uncle who I hadn't spoken to in years called to say I should let it slide for your father's sake. It was as if they had all agreed that I was the problem, not the theft, not the lies, not the betrayal, but me for daring to say no. I stopped answering. I silenced my phone, let the messages pile up, and focused on the quiet of my apartment. At night, though, it wasn't quiet. At night, the words looped in my head. Useless dreamer, ungrateful son, selfish. I would lie awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if maybe they were right. Maybe I had become arrogant. Maybe I was cold. Maybe the success I had worked for all these years didn't erase the flaws they had hammered into me since childhood. It hit hardest one Friday evening. I had just finished a 14-hour shift, a surgery that dragged on longer than expected, and I came home to find an envelope slid under my door. No return address, just my name in my father's handwriting. My chest tightened before I even opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Scrawled across it, in his sharp, impatient script, "You will regret turning your back on us. Blood is blood. You can't escape family." I sat on the floor, the letter trembling in my hands, and for the first time in years, I cried. Not a quiet tear, not a choked sob, but the kind of raw, shaking grief that comes when you realize the people who were supposed to protect you are the very ones destroying you. I hated that he could still get to me, still strip me down to nothing with a few sentences. But somewhere in that breakdown, something else stirred. I don't know if it was anger, or survival, or just exhaustion, but a thought took root. I can't live like this anymore. I couldn't keep letting their voices drown out my own. I couldn't keep pretending I was part of a family that saw me as nothing but a scapegoat and a wallet. The next morning, I started small. I called the bank again, set up even tighter security measures. I reached out to a lawyer friend just to ask about my options if this kind of fraud continued. I didn't tell him everything, just enough to plant the seed. And then, for the first time in years, I opened a notebook and began to write. Not medical notes, not work plans, but a simple list. At the top, what I will no longer tolerate. The list grew quickly. No more unannounced visits. No more financial manipulation. No more letting their words define me. By the time I put the pen down, my hand was shaking, but not from fear. From something else, resolve, maybe. The fog wasn't gone, but for the first time, I could see a faint outline of the path ahead. I wasn't ready yet. I was still wounded, still reeling. But I knew one thing. I was done being their victim. And sooner or later, they were going to see just how much of a useless dreamer I had really been. The shift didn't happen overnight. It wasn't some cinematic moment where I woke up one morning with all the pain gone and a clear plan in front of me. It was gradual, like the slow return of feeling in a limb that's been asleep for too long. But the more I leaned into my own life and away from theirs, the more I started to realize how much space they had been taking up in my head. Work, for one, became a sanctuary. I'd always been proud of what I did, but now I threw myself into it with renewed focus. I took on more challenging surgeries, mentored younger doctors, and accepted speaking invitations I would have avoided before. The hospital director pulled me aside one day and said, "Evan, you know you're becoming one of our cornerstones here." It floored me. For years I had been hearing only one narrative, that I was inadequate, undeserving, a disappointment. To have someone I respected acknowledge my value felt like oxygen after being underwater too long. The recognition spread outside the hospital walls. I published a paper on a surgical technique I'd refined, and it gained traction in medical circles. Soon, I was invited to present at a conference overseas. Standing on that stage, lights hot on my face, looking out at hundreds of peers scribbling notes and nodding along. It was like finally stepping into the life I had always envisioned but had been too weighed down to believe I deserved. Financially, too, things blossomed. With my new focus came opportunities one might have overlooked before. I invested smartly, not recklessly, and for the first time in my life, I felt secure. I wasn't just making money. I was building something sustainable. And the irony wasn't lost on me. The same man who mocked me as a useless dreamer was now, indirectly, fueling my drive to ensure I was never dependent on him or anyone else again. But it wasn't only work. I started tending to my personal life in a way I hadn't before. I reconnected with friends I had drifted from, people who reminded me of who I was outside of the family shadow. I even allowed myself to date again. Nothing serious at first, but even casual dinners and conversations felt like reclaiming pieces of myself I had forgotten I owned. The laughter came easier. The silence in my apartment no longer felt oppressive. It felt peaceful. Of course, word of my successes trickled back to my family, and with it came their predictable reactions. Melanie sent me a text one evening after the conference photos surfaced online. "Wow, Mr. Big Shot now, huh? Don't forget who changed your diapers." It was meant as a jab, but all it did was confirm how small their world had become. My dad, according to a cousin, had started telling people that my achievements were luck or overhyped. The more I rose, the more desperate he became to drag me back down. And yet, their bitterness no longer hit the same way. It didn't cut, it bounced off. For the first time, I wasn't scrambling to prove myself. I didn't need their approval. I had my own, and that was enough. Still, in quiet moments, I felt the sting of the past. I'd catch myself remembering the courtroom, the loan attempt, the letter shoved under my door. The anger hadn't disappeared, it had transformed. It wasn't the raw, consuming kind anymore. It was steady, simmering, focused. I knew better than to act rashly. But I also knew this. The power dynamic had shifted. They had tried to paint me as a failure. They had tried to use me as a crutch. They had tried to break me. And yet, here I was, stronger, sharper, untethered. And slowly, a thought began to take shape. What if I didn't just walk away? What if, instead, I showed them, calmly, deliberately, exactly who I had become? Not through shouting matches, not through petty arguments, but through actions they couldn't twist, achievements they couldn't deny, and choices that would leave them no room to manipulate me again. I wasn't ready to pull the trigger yet, but for the first time in my life, I realized something. I didn't need to survive their games anymore. I was in a position to end them. The setup began almost by accident. I wasn't sitting around plotting, at least not consciously. But when you've spent years on the defensive, years absorbing hits from every angle, your eyes start picking up details other people miss. You learn to notice patterns, to connect dots, to file away information for later. And as my life steadied and grew, I realized those old habits, born from survival, were now giving me an edge. It started with Melanie. Word reached me through a mutual acquaintance, one of her old college friends who'd been in town for a wedding, that she and her husband were in deeper financial trouble than anyone knew. Their dream house had turned into a money pit. Renovations had stalled, bills piled up, and apparently the attempted loan in my name wasn't just desperation, it was necessity. The house was half finished, mortgage payments were eating them alive, and they were quietly borrowing from family members just to stay afloat. I filed that away. Then there was my father. I'd mostly avoided direct contact, but one day while checking on some family property records, something I had neglected for years, I noticed something peculiar. A tract of land that had belonged to my late uncle. The very property at the heart of that courtroom dispute had been quietly transferred. On paper, it looked like a sale, but the numbers didn't add up. The buyer was a Shell LLC, and when I dug deeper through public records, I noticed something odd. The LLC had been registered by one of my father's longtime drinking buddies, a man who couldn't spell equity if you spotted him the first 5 letters. It didn't take much imagination to realize Dad was hiding assets, playing games with paperwork, probably to keep them out of reach of other relatives or creditors. I filed that away too. The final piece fell into my lap at work. A colleague, knowing my family was local, casually mentioned seeing my father arguing at the county office. He hadn't noticed me nearby, but apparently the clerk had gotten fed up with his yelling and told him, loud enough for half the office to hear, "Sir, if you don't pay the overdue taxes, this property will be repossessed. It doesn't matter what your family name is. Overdue taxes, hidden transfers, a daughter drowning in debt." For the first time in years, I didn't just feel like their scapegoat. I felt like someone standing in the shadows, watching as they dug their own graves with shovels they didn't realize I could see. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. They had always assumed I was powerless, that I was too timid or too naive to fight back. They banked on the version of me they had bullied into silence. But that man was gone. In his place stood someone with resources, connections, and knowledge, and most importantly, patience. So I began to prepare. Quietly, deliberately. I reached out to that lawyer friend again, this time not just to ask about fraud protections, but to walk me through the finer points of property law and inheritance disputes. I framed it as curiosity, professional interest, but I listened carefully, making notes. I reviewed my own finances, strengthened my protections, ensured that nothing of mine could be touched without my consent. And then, slowly, I started gathering receipts, literal and figurative, copies of public records, notes from conversations, printouts of tax delinquencies, whispers I heard from mutual acquaintances. Each one went into a folder I kept locked in my office. Not because I was ready to use them yet, but because I knew a day would come when the opportunity presented itself. Every evening, when I sat in my quiet apartment with the folder on my desk, I felt the weight of it. It wasn't heavy physically, but symbolically, it carried years of insults, manipulation, betrayal. Years of being told I was nothing. Now, finally, I had proof that the very people who mocked me were balancing on a house of cards. And when that house started to shake, I would be ready. I didn't rush it. That was the key. Revenge, at least the kind that leaves an echo, isn't about snapping back in anger. It's about patience. Timing. making sure the other side never sees the punch until it's already landed. And for months, I watched quietly as the cracks in my family's facade widened. It started with Melanie. Her situation with the house reached a breaking point. Contractors had walked off the job, unpaid. The mortgage was behind. She and her husband were juggling credit cards to cover groceries, but outwardly they still tried to project this image of moving up in the world. I waited, saying nothing, until one evening she called me, her voice brittle. "Evan," she started, forcing brightness into her tone. "You know, I've been thinking about how close we used to be as kids. Don't you miss that? I feel like we've drifted, and I'd love to rebuild that bond. Family is everything, you know?" I let her talk for nearly 10 minutes before cutting in. "How much do you need?" There was a pause. Then she laughed nervously. "What? Oh, come on, Evan, I wasn't." "How much?" I repeated. The silence stretched, and finally she admitted it. They were staring down foreclosure. They needed tens of thousands, fast. I told her I'd think about it. But instead of wiring her a cent, I sent an anonymous tip to the bank's fraud department about her prior attempt to co-sign under my name. I attached documentation I had carefully saved. I knew it wouldn't land her in prison, not yet, but it would put a red flag on any financial application she touched, which meant that when she and her husband tried to refinance to save the house, the doors slammed shut. The foreclosure notice came within weeks, and I never had to raise my voice, never had to lift more than a pen. Then came my father. His Shell LLC game had always been sloppy, and I suspected he counted on no one in the family being savvy enough to connect the dots. But I wasn't the boy who once got mocked for losing money mowing lawns. I was a surgeon, precise by nature, patient by training, and armed with knowledge. With the help of my lawyer friend, I compiled every record I'd uncovered. The transfers, the overdue taxes, the shady registrations. We didn't go straight to court. No, that would have been too obvious. Instead, we filed a quiet inquiry with the county, citing concerns over irregular property transfers. Bureaucracy is slow, but it's relentless. Weeks later, my father stormed into the family group chat, raging about government parasites and nosy officials. He didn't know it was me who had lit the match. All I had to do was sit back as the county flagged his properties for review and the IRS took an interest in his taxes. And still, I kept my distance. That was the most satisfying part. I didn't argue with him. I didn't show up to shout matches. I didn't give him the satisfaction of knowing I was behind it. I lived my life, attended conferences, scrubbed into surgeries, smiled at colleagues. Meanwhile, behind the curtain, the world he thought he controlled was collapsing. The final stroke came when an extended relative, the same cousin who had once texted me parroting my dad's insults, reached out in a panic. "Did you hear about your dad? They're saying he might lose the property. And Melanie, she and her husband are back living with your mom. It's bad, Evan. Real bad." I almost laughed, but I didn't. Instead, I said calmly, "I hope they figure it out." That was the beauty of it. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to declare victory. The revenge wasn't about rubbing their faces in it. It was about finally shifting the power. They had spent years telling everyone I was nothing. Now, without me lifting a finger in their direction, their own greed, lies, and entitlement had dragged them under. And they knew it. The next time I saw my father, at a relative's funeral, of all places, he looked smaller. Not physically, but in presence. He approached me, opened his mouth like he wanted to sneer, but no words came. Just a tight, pale smile, and then he turned away. For the first time in my life, he had nothing to say to me. But I wasn't finished yet. The fallout came faster than I expected. Within a few months, everything my father had spent years clinging to, the image of control, the carefully spun lies about his success, the pedestal he built by tearing me down, crumbled. The county seized one of his properties for unpaid taxes. The IRS froze his accounts while they dug through years of filings. And with his name tied to suspicious transfers, suddenly the friends he'd relied on for shady favors disappeared one by one. Melanie and her husband, meanwhile, had no house, no savings, and no credit worth speaking of. They slunk back into my parents' home, filling it with tension. My mom, caught between loyalty and exhaustion, started calling me late at night, her voice trembling. "I don't know how much more of this I can take, Evan," she whispered once. But I had nothing to offer her except silence. I wasn't going to be her bandage while she refused to stop bleeding for my father and sister. The whispers in the extended family shifted, too. The same relatives who once parroted my father's lines about me being selfish now avoided eye contact with him. At gatherings, conversations stopped when he walked in. The humiliation he once loved to heap on me now lived squarely on his shoulders. He tried to fight it, of course, tried to spin news stories about how he was being persecuted, how the government had a vendetta against him, how Evan turned cold and abandoned us. But this time, no one laughed along. No one nodded. They just looked at him the way you look at a man ranting on a street corner, bitter and broken. And me? I lived. I thrived. My career continued to rise. My name gained recognition, and my circle of friends and colleagues grew stronger. For once, my life wasn't defined by what they said or didn't say. I had stepped out of their shadow, and they had collapsed under the weight of their own entitlement. The final moment came one Sunday morning. I was leaving a cafe downtown when I saw him, my father, sitting alone on a bench. His clothes were wrinkled, his face drawn, his shoulders hunched. He looked up, and for the briefest moment, I saw a recognition flicker in his eyes. The man who had once towered over me, mocking me at every chance, now looked small, powerless. He opened his mouth, maybe to ask for help, maybe to beg for something. Money, forgiveness, I'll never know. I didn't stop walking. I met his eyes, calm and steady, and simply said, "You were wrong about me." And then I left him there, sitting in the silence he had once weaponized against me. For the first time in my life, it wasn't me who carried the weight of his words, it was him. And that was the most satisfying revenge of all.